I do want to talk about the still standing domino scene with Mr. Levin, because that's a really good scene. And I talked about how I reuse things. If you remember, I had the play with the Lujack sisters,
Yes.
and the one older, prettier version, prettier sister, I mentioned very casually, or I think I had the Scoey character mentioned that there was this old guy who lived next door who lusted for the girl, and so I mentioned that in this play as well. But the whole metaphor, I told you the Drake equation is going to be a metaphor used in this play that's coming up. But the whole metaphor for the still standing domino is the idea. You've seen those endless videos where someone tips a domino, and then maybe it makes Bugs Bunny's face go from a frown to a smile, or it goes up and down, and this and that, and you'll have literally a 500,000 to 1,000,000 dominoes lined up over several days by people. Well, I'd mentioned, if you remember, I think it might have been in A Norwegian in the Family, it might have been my spy book. I mentioned how the spy or his brother, they go to a magician and they debunk the scene. The spy debunks the scene. I think it's in the spy book. That was based upon the same incident where I went with this older man who lived next door, who took me and two of my friends to this magic show, and I debunked like 10 or 12 of their tricks in a row. And then I couldn't. I don't remember what the last trick was. I couldn't debunk it. And afterwards, the teacher from the high school in Staten Island came over to me, and I thought he was going to be pissed at me for ruining his show, but he was actually, I guess, impressed with my intellect and whatnot. And he sort of told me this story, I think, to get me off of my failure to explain the last thing. And the story was basically that not only did he run this magic club, but he was also in charge of this domino show. These kids at this Tottenville High School in Staten Island, it was a sort of a performing high school where people who would do magic or act or sing would go to. Anyway, he tells me this story that sometime maybe 5 to 10 years earlier, they would have these big mats. There was an old, I don't know if you ever played the board game Twister. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So they would have these big mats where they would have intricately placed, they'd spread out maybe 1,000 square feet, and they'd intricately place where the dominoes was to be. And this was all plotted out on their computers back in the 70s. And he said that he did this, I guess, dozens or hundreds of times. And then one domino didn't fall the right way. And instead of falling to hit the next domino, it just went off like to the left or the right. And that's where the idea for the still standing domino, that imagine this, and he said it was something like 1 in 7 or 800 octillion, that he had a friend who had a friend at MIT who calculated it, that if you were tipping over the same thing once every second, tipping over the same thing from the start of the universe, it would take a quadrillion times longer than the universe has existed for that to happen again. Now, did that really happen? Did a gust of wind knock the domino or whatnot? Whatever it might have been. Maybe he was just bullshitting to tell me a tale to make him.
I'm trying to say this. I don't think it impacts the art. But first, the scene, you go through all the tricks, and there's blackouts. There's one that's set in full with the rabbit in the hat.
Yeah.
And then the rest are just blackouts, and then it goes to this Levin scene where he's talking about this. That story I heard when I was a poker player.
Yeah.
Many, many times in different versions. I heard the domino story too.
Yeah.
So that story has been passed around, and everyone has had a friend at MIT or at BCIT or at all these different places. So I know that story is something that he was passing off as a bit of knowledge.
Yeah.
And I've heard about
most
the
likely
octillion stuff. Sometimes it's sometimes it's a quadrillion, sometimes it's an octillion.
Yeah.
It depends.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you say that, because I've never heard anyone say that, but it has flourished on the internet. But the defining metaphor is that the still standing domino might think that it's special. If, let's say, that's a human being. So this relates back to Megan and the Bridget characters, is that do these things happen because someone is this gets to the idea of free will, obviously. What you earlier asked, what is the relation between Megan and the Bridget character, well, there's probably none, unless maybe there is some creative toppling the dominoes of Danny's life, or Megan's life, or Michael's life, or Bridget's life. Uh, but who knows? But it gives it a good defining metaphor to come back to. And anyway, I just want to. I think that it's an important thing to take what
Also,
you
who,
say is an
if you're
internet
going
rumor.
to use it as a metaphor, who is the domino
Yeah,
in it? It could be many different characters.
yeah. Who is the domino, or is there no domino? And what is the thing that is it just random
Also, it's
chance?
interesting where he says the still standing domino. I believe that he describes it in a way where there's 300,000 plus dominoes,
Hmm.
and 160,000 of them fall. And he focuses on the one that's just after
Yeah,
the one domino somehow goes to the left.
yeah,
But there are many still standing dominoes
yeah,
in that field. You would expect this sort of scene sort of played in something like the Fog of War or a war film, but
yeah,
it's in a human drama as
yeah,
well.
yeah. And it's good to know that it's, I guess you would call, I guess, what is that, Snopes.com, that debunks, urban legends. That from what you're saying, you've heard this as an urban legend too. So, I know myself, I had not heard that before this man. I figured it probably was, but again, that in and of itself, that this is a person telling the urban legend, that gives us an into the character, that the Mr. Levin was probably trying to salve Danny's broken or fragile ego, that he failed in the one time he tried to debunk it, which then could then tie into, well, what was Danny trying to do to help Megan, or Megan trying to help Danny? Why is Danny focused on this other beautiful girl from the past who was, nothing really special other than her looks when she was a teenager? These are the kinds of things that you can make connections, and you can go this way, that way, the other way, and how does it play out? Who knows?